Hi, I'm Quincas and I'm a synth DIY guy, and welcome to my demo video for the Robaux SWT16 Plus. So without further ado, let's get to it. This is basically a pad matrix trigger sequencer, and it's a vast improvement over its predecessor, the SWT16, particularly because the user interface is much more accessible now. You don't have to memorize the manual because you actually have little icons here that show what each button does. One of the pads is the shift button. You don't have a separate button for that. Now you can have up to 8 patterns, and you have these white buttons here that represent the patterns. They also serve many different functions depending on which edit mode you're in. I'm gonna press shift here, and there's a garbage can on pad 14 here. So that's the X, right? So now I can press number 1, and that'll erase. Once I press any of these white buttons here, that'll erase my pad number 1. So now let's go back to sequencer, and I can choose my kick drum here. If I press play here, you see the movement of this is sort of a cursor, right? It means the active step. And you can program the kick drum line right there. Now we can press the shift button to come out of that and back into selecting. And this is going to be our hi-hat. There you go. Let's go back to the kick and add, a little bit more interest. Now let's go back to the selection page. Select number 3, which is sort of a pre-snare. And select number 4, which is the strong snare. A little bit too much of my spring reverb there. That's a little better. And you can program up to 16 channels that way. I only have up to number 9 connected to my Nutella module here, which is a Tsunami Eurorack front end by Tesseract Modular. And it's just triggering some samples. So let's go back to selection, and over here number 8 is kind of a tom, I think. Yeah. One of the new features is program mode number 2, which is Euclidean. Let's press that, and you can't draw an E, so they do like a C, but that C is basically Euclidean mode. And now we can choose again, let's say my snare, right? The main snare here. And now the white buttons represent different pages for programming the Euclidean sequence. This is the number of steps. Number 2 is the offset. So you can basically offset your pattern by 1, 2, 3, 4, however many steps you want. And then number 3 is the length. So I have my length set to 15 here right now. So that makes that snare kind of crooked. It kind of changes at every cycle because it's not completing 16 steps. It's starting again after every 15. Okay, so if I put it back on 16, we get a repetitive rhythm. Whereas if I change it to, I don't know, 14 steps, and get something different. I can offset them. Now let's do the same with the kick drum. So first I press the shift button here to go back into channel selection. Now I'll select channel 1, which is my kick, right? Now I can, again, maybe give it 2 steps with an 11 step length, and offset it just 1. Cool, I'm creating some interesting polyrhythms here. Now let's go back to select, and we'll choose the hi-hat, which was number 2, right? And again, this time we'll give it 11 steps, and on length here we'll make it 14. So again, this is also going to be cycling weird. 13, make it an odd number. byte pad number 4 here shows you a visual representation of the pattern that's been generated with the Euclidean mode. So we can choose the kick drum here and go to byte 4, and that's showing us our basic kick arrangement, even though that's changing according to the length right here, right? Go back to selection here, and we'll choose number 9, which is a ride, right? There you go. And now we'll change the number of steps to 9 steps. So pretty much every 9 steps it's triggering. And here I can offset. Now let's see this other mode here, the third edit mode. And that's T for tapping. That means I can actually tap the rhythms that I want. So, see, I just tapped that tom right there. I just did a little clave pattern with the ride symbol over here. Cool. Now let's move on to the performance modes, which is the second row over here. First performance mode is the mute. So here you can mute any of the, just by pressing the corresponding channel button. And this can be pretty cool during your arrangement or live performance to have just a few of the drum elements happening and some others be muted. Right? So let's go to performance mode number 2, which is the fill mode. And you see a little F there. It's like a roller effect. Whatever pad you press will sound repeatedly at every step of the sequence. So there's that preparation snare right there. That's the stronger snare right there. Here's the hi-hat. Here's the tom-tom. And you can do it with many. Kick and snare right there. Kick, snare, and tom. Both toms. Crash right there. Ride. Cool, so that's pretty cool. Next one is the letter C, which is clock reset. So you can reset the clock on any of the pads that you press. You start its cycle again. I particularly like the perform, which is the 4th button on the second row, because this gives you everything. You can do tap, you can do mute, and you can do fill. But you can only do them on 4 instruments at a time. So right here, the bottom orange row selects which row of channels you're affecting in this performance mode. So let's go to number 1, and here we have our kick, hi-hat, snare, and snare, right? So we can mute them by just pressing those buttons. Now the second row here does the fill. So I can do a fill with any of these sounds by just holding the button right beneath it. And the bottom one sets to record, so you can tap record it. Cool. I come out of record and now it stays, and I can mute it, or I can do a fill with it. Right? Let's do something with this snare right here. Set to record. Let's clear this pattern again. So X, choose the pattern, and say yes. Okay, now we'll program a beat from scratch again. So we'll come back here to, so this time we'll use the step sequencer just for the kick, and we'll do a 4 on the floor. Now we'll go to tap over here and do the hi-hat. So excuse my performance, but it turned out okay. So now we'll go to the snare. Let's go back to perform, P, and I want to record a little bit of that hi-hat. The snare here too. Cool. And why don't we record some kick drum variations too? Cool. And here I can do some fills. And I can mute. Let's go back to listening to those. Snare. Cool. So let's say I like this pattern. I want to move to a different pattern. I just press that white button at the bottom there, and we're at a new pattern now. And if I go here to sequence, choose the kick, I can do another pattern. Let's do one real quick. Cool. A little pattern there. Now, this is pattern 2. If I choose pattern 1, it'll go back to that first pattern we're working on. Pretty nifty, very easy, straightforward way right from the first page to change to different patterns that you've saved. Now you can also save all 8 of your patterns along with all your sequencer settings here in the preset. To save it, you press the second button here and then where you want to save it. So I'm going to save it on number 2. And there it is. Cool. So now if I press preset button again, which is the third blue button down here, you see that the one that's flashing is the one that's currently loaded. And we can press number 1 here and then load number 2. There's that first pattern we made, and here's the second pattern we made. They're saved on number 2 here. If I go back and load, which is number 1, load number 1, it'll go back to whatever had saved on number 1 originally. Yeah, that's a totally different pattern that we didn't do today. Here's the clock button. On this button up top, you can turn off the internal clock, and then you need to send it an external clock, which, I don't know, let's use the rising ramp from my teaser here. Let's send it right into this jack right here. So now I have a manual or a voltage controllable clock. But let's say you didn't want to use that, we can press this button again and it'll go back to its internal clock. This bottom button right here is the play. And now you have this minus and plus here, and that's how you change the tempo. You press any of the buttons on the plus and it gets faster. You press any of the buttons on the minus and it gets slower. You can press 3 buttons at once on the minus and it gets slower faster. Same happens with the plus. Right? There you go. So that's how you speed up or slow down the internal clock. Let's go back to the external clock. And that way I can synchronize it to another sequencer like my BeatStep Pro, for example. So what's next in the menu here? This is length. And I can choose number 1 and change its length. Cool. So that's how you can change the length of any of your patterns on any of your channels. And you can make them offset, do some strange polyrhythmic stuff. So right now I'm just fiddling with the length of the kick drum channel on pattern 1. Oh, that's really cool. Number 3 on row 3, just pad 11, changes the direction, the play direction on any of the patterns. So it inverts whatever you have programmed in there. It starts playing it backwards. These are some really cool ways to experiment with your sequence and find different results. And V are values. And you have different values that you can set. And these include the length reset, the gate. You can choose to combine 2 or more consecutive steps into one long gate or trigger them at each step. You can invert the gate. There's a coin that randomly decides at each step whether the step will be played or not. There's a trigger mod. The step becomes a square wave LFO. Oh, that's cool. So select the 5th white button to go to trigger modulation. So now we're getting that LFO at the hi-hat. Down here are the sequencer settings. So we've already messed with the clock quite a bit. And here's delete, right? So that's for deleting any sequence that you want to start again with. We've already done that too. Here's write. You can write all your current patterns of the sequencer to the memory so that the settings are not lost when you switch off the modular system. So anytime you want to save your current state, you just press Shift and Write, which is the 3rd button on the sequencer settings row, which is row number 4. So there's this cool trick you can do now using the trigger modulation thing. So let's try that. Let's program a simple beat. So this has trigger modulation in it, right? It's hi-hat track number 2. Let's remove that. Pad number 12. The 5th white button goes to trigger modulation and we can turn it off here. Okay. So we press over here and now we can come over to 13 here, which is not assigned to anything, and we can assign it to trigger number 2. Now we can go back to trigger and we'll choose 13 and we'll select a particular trigger modulation setting for it. Now we can come back to sequencer and we'll choose 13 and that'll be a second hi-hat that'll be trigger modulated. And this is a way that you can have rolls and flams and things like that, but not on every hit of a particular instrument. You simply assigned 2 channels to trigger the same instrument, and then you can have one of them with trigger modulation and the other one not. Right? So this is a boring pattern. Let's add a snare to it. Now let's do the same with the snare, okay, with the first snare. So we'll come here to values, right? Number 12, values. Okay, now we'll come to number 6, which is output routing. And we'll choose 14 and we'll set it to also trigger what's on number 3, right? Now we come back to trigger, which is white button number 5 on the values mode. And we'll come here to number 14 and we'll set that to have a modulation setting. Now we can go back to the sequencer here. We'll go back to 12 here, back to the trigger and choose 14 again. There you go. Cool, so only whatever I program on channel 14 gets flammed. So one is flammed, one is not, and that one is over here. Cool. Let's make it faster. Cool. And lastly, I like this, so I'm going to save it. So I'll come here to the preset. I'll press 2 for save, and I'll press number 2. And now it goes through this little routine to show you that it's being saved. And then you get this little flash, and there you have it. Cool. So this is just a few things that you can do with this thing. It's very deep. It comes with a manual, and there's just a lot you can do with it. You can have different clock divisions for channels. You can have different lengths up to 64 steps. I've been doing everything in just 16 steps, but you can go up to 64 steps. There's just a lot you can do with it. It's a really cool sequencer. I hope you liked this video. If you did, hit like, subscribe, watch the build video if you're interested in building the kit, and I'll see you soon, and stay noisy. All right.